So let's talk about tissue development. So the endocrine system, of course, has lots of roles within the body. One of which is the regulation of tissue growth or degradation. All right. So for muscle development and growth, um, thyroid hormone is an example of a hormone which does have an effect on hypertrophy and muscle size, but it's not explicitly an anabolic agent. It's more an anti-catabolic agent. So it protects lean mass under situations where atrophy may be occurring, but it doesn't act strictly to stimulate growth in itself. Um, Catecholamines are a hormone which are somewhat controversial in the role of muscle development. The reason being is um, it's difficult to directly link catecholamines to muscular development, though people who have um, a substantial catecholamine release may have an advantage in things like lifting or having a drive to exercise, which means they may be more muscularly developed. It's just more of a question of are the catecholamines themselves causing the growth, or are the catecholamines in system causing the person to want to exercise, and by extension, the fact that they're exercising, that would be why they maybe have more musculature. One of the reasons why it's thought that catecholamines are in fact somehow involved in the process of muscular development is that in cattle, um, in cows, you actually have an increase in muscle mass or more meat production when they're given epinephrine. So, um, relevant to that, you might be asking yourself, why do I care about cows? And strictly, you probably shouldn't, but it's kind of a funny thing. Most supplements, most of the major things that we know as performance enhancing drugs, at least in the realm of tissue growth and muscle growth, um, they've come from the beef industry, the meat industry. And the reason being, of course, is that if you can inject a cow with some sort of an anabolic agent, some sort of a growth hormone, perhaps, you can make more meat in less time for less head of cattle, so it's more cost efficient. So, um, a lot of the early people who started to take testosterone and started to take growth hormone in the bodybuilding world and in the sporting world were taking the research that was done in cattle and then saying, well, if it works on a cow, I guess it'll work on me too. So that's why it's mentioned, because a lot of what we know of, like I say, a lot of things we know of supplement world and muscle growth agents, those originate in the beef industry, and then people experiment on themselves and researchers bring it over, that sort of thing. So anyway, it's worth a mention. Alrighty, so the major things that we would link to muscular development would probably be anabolic hormones and insulin-like growth factors. Okay, so anabolic hormones that's a blanket term for um, I don't know, close to 100, maybe more um, derived uh, steroid-based hormone complexes, which are really all stem from testosterone and growth hormone. But anyway, their job is to cause muscle growth. Okay, um, both growth hormone and testosterone are lipid based. They're steroid. They cause muscles to take up protein and they cause more protein growth, so you get direct increases in muscle size from that. Insulin and insulin-like growth factors. So insulin itself, the same one, the exact same hormone as you get a mass fluctuation with during eating. Um, it in addition to it's signaling your muscles to take up sugar and cells to take up fat, it also tells cells to take up protein as well. So you get a much faster uptake of circulating amino acids in the blood, and that leads to faster protein synthesis in the muscle. Uh, I read a review within the last year or two, and they cited an article where they gave people insulin in various doses, and they found up to a 70% increase in protein synthesis directly after exercise when insulin was injected. So it's a bit of a dangerous game though, because as we know of insulin, if you inject insulin, it drops your blood sugar. If you have too much insulin in your system and not enough blood sugar to counteract it, you'll you'll go hypoglycemic, lose consciousness, perhaps die. So, there's a give and take to getting your swole on. Um, and then insulin-like growth factor. We'll talk about that a little bit later. That's another major anabolic factor. All right, so testosterone, kind of the biggest of all these things. So, testosterone, as I said, is an anabolic steroid hormone. It directly stimulates cells or muscle cells to produce proteins to hypertrophy. All right, and the effectiveness of testosterone in its natural form, the effectiveness of testosterone is relative to the fraction of the total amount of testosterone that's in the blood and the amount of what's called free testosterone. All right, so in order to explain that, we have to talk a little bit about sex hormone binding globulin, or SHBG. Okay, so sex hormone binding globulin is a carrier protein. Okay, it's what testosterone in the blood is mostly bound to. All right, so you have a certain amount of testosterone in the blood that's always floating around. Males and females. Males, of course, have more, but anyway, you have a certain amount floating around in your blood, and the majority, we're talking something 95%ish of that testosterone will be bound to this SHBG molecule. Okay, and then what that does is it just kind of inactivates that protein, or sorry, that hormone. It inactivates testosterone. So that testosterone, which is instead to be bound, okay, said to be bound, it can't interact with cells. It's not able to go and meet with its receptor and cause that protein synthesis effect. So for lack of, it's essentially just unusable testosterone. Now once the amount of free testosterone starts to drop, some of this testosterone that's bound with SHBG will release, and it to a certain extent allows you to carry testosterone and not have to produce it on the fly all the time. All right, so it's a reserve, if you will. But if you have less SHBG in your system, then you have more free testosterone, so you have more usable testosterone. So one of the things that happens with exercise, with testosterone, you don't produce more testosterone as you start exercising more. People who lift, guys who've been lifting for 10 or 15 years, and they're very hypertrophied, very strong, it's not necessarily the fact that they have lifted which has caused them to produce more testosterone chronically, like at rest all the time. But there is research that points to the possibility of exercise reducing the amount of SHBG in your system. So while you may not have as much, you may not have more overall testosterone, as a net you'd have more usable testosterone, right? Because you have less SHBG, which means you have more free testosterone, and that would be as a net perspective, once again, that would give you more effect of that testosterone. Alrighty, so some other things to talk about with testosterone. there are things called androgen precursors. Um, One thing you got to realize about the way steroid hormones are produced, um, you don't actually produce or rather carry a lot of testosterone in your system. Steroids are pretty easy to produce rapidly from cholesterol, um, and but in order for you to take that LDL cholesterol and turn it into testosterone, it has to go through a number of stages. Okay, so just like if we were looking at something like the like glycolysis, where you take glucose and you're breaking it down into a number of precursors before it eventually turns into um, pyruvate. Much the same thing happens with testosterone. Okay, so cholesterol is broken down, and through many stages of change, eventually you get testosterone, or you get estrogen, or you get, you name it. Okay, so there's this idea that while testosterone itself is an illegal drug, what happened a while back is people started to go, well, what if we just ate or intook precursors to testosterone, right? So steroid hormones, which are very close to being testosterone toward the end of that process of creating it. And what if we took the precursor? If you took a precursor, then once it hits the system, you should metabolize it into testosterone, right? It should be turned over into testosterone, which in a roundabout way would increase your T level. So that's a thought, and there are a number of them on the market, some of which have been banned, some which aren't. Um, the effectiveness of these factors um, is somewhat debatable. Okay, in general, the stuff that's outlawed, the stuff that's you know a controlled substance, probably works pretty well. Um, if you're going to GNC and they're handing you a bottle of precursor that's been on the market for 10 years, probably doesn't work. Simply because if it's actually going to increase testosterone levels, and it's proven to, the government would have already outlawed it. So by logical conclusion, then whatever they're selling you is maybe placebo effect. I don't know, but not actually going to work for increasing T um, through the precursor action. So anyway, like I said, the general results, if you look at most of the research, you're gonna see a grab bag. You're gonna see some studies show no results. Some studies will show a slight increase in testosterone production, but there's no real consensus on this as of right now. All right, but it's this. I like to always tell the story of this as well. People who abuse testosterone, who take it illegally. Um, the testosterone, as we talk about precursors and how you take cholesterol and turn it into testosterone, it's worth noting that the pathway to create testosterone is only a few steps removed from the pathway of creating estrogen, and the body really doesn't like having too much of anything. So what it'll often do, and one of the reasons why men can develop things like gynecomastia, which is increased breast tissue. Okay, one of the reasons why that can happen um, is that when people take too much testosterone, if the body registers that it has way too much available, it'll start turning some of that testosterone into estrogen, and so guys can, like I say, develop breast tissue, which is a female trait, and the opposite can occur as well. Women who start taking testosterone, they start developing male sexual characteristics, facial hair, Adam's apples, deepening of voice, that sort of stuff. It's not completely abnormal. Enlarged clitoris, that's kind of some of the stuff that goes along with it. So, and then of course the other thing, the reason why in men testicles begin to shrink when taking massive doses of testosterone, because of course testosterone is produced in the testicles. Okay, so that's where we get testosterone from, In large part, there's a little bit produced in other parts of the body, but for the most part, that's where it's going to be coming from. And the body's always trying to regulate itself. Okay, and so if there's a if it senses that testosterone is too high, the feedback loop will essentially then trigger. We're producing. It'll give a message something like this: we're producing too much testosterone, therefore we need to start producing less of it. And your body's way of producing less of a hormone, less of a just testosterone in this case, is to make the gland smaller, which in this case would be the testicles. So the testicles start to atrophy and get smaller because the body thinks it's producing too much testosterone when in fact you're injecting with a needle or a pill or something. So that's why you see reduction in testicle size with testosterone abuse. And there's certain ways people have cocktails to prevent that from happening and various other things. It's not as though everybody who does that has those effects, but that is a common side effect. All right, so acute responses. So acute being right as you're exercising, directly afterward, that sort of thing. Okay, so with testosterone, the acute response to exercise is an increase in the total amount of testosterone produced. Okay, in women, um, some studies will say yes, there's others that say no, but the general consensus is in women you're also going to have an increase in testosterone. The response is just much greater in men. It's a several-fold increase, a much higher amount of testosterone is released while you're exercising, primarily doing resistance training in this case. All right, and my next slide kind of underscores this, but one of my pet peeves is going to the gym and seeing mostly women, ladies, lifting weights that are just excessively light over and over again because they don't want to gain muscle. Um, and part of why I bring it up here is testosterone, as I said, it is slightly increased in women while they lift weights, but when I say slightly, it maybe goes up 5 or 10%. In men, we're talking 200, 300, 400 times percent more released. So it's a little bit of a different thing, and women, as most of any of you who are listening would know, it's not really that easy to gain muscle. Most females have a difficult time with it, simply because they don't have as much anabolic hormone coursing through their veins. Men, with our increased levels of testosterone, put on muscle much faster because we have more testosterone circulating. Women don't have as much. They have estrogen, which is kind of an anti-anabolic. It impedes muscle growth. It somewhat shields women from that. So I is it to say that women can never have large muscles? No, of course that's false. Just like men can have small muscles as well. It's more about the rate of things. Guys have an easier time putting on muscle mass. Doesn't mean women can't. It means they have to work harder. They have to work for a longer period of time. But the hormonal mix within our systems is what governs that. Is what kind of governs how fast you put on that musculature. And for most women, my recommendation is to lift heavy, use the same repetition scheme, the same exercise plan as a man would, because the difference is going to be drastic for your bone density, your strength gain, your overall metabolic rate. All these sorts of things will be much better if you use a traditional normal male lifting routine, which I shouldn't say male at this point. It's just a human lifting routine. Okay. More so than picking up a little 5-pound weight and going to town lifting it over and over again, because you're not stressing any of your systems. You're not really doing much. You're wasting your time. Um, so anyway, um, here's my slide on this. Okay, I already gave you the spiel, but yeah, RDJ there in the corner. He this underscores what I feel whenever I'm in the gym, right here. Why? Why is this happening? Okay. Um, anyway, enough said on this. Don't need to go further with it. And I just think this is funny. So I'll give you a second to read this, but I'll move right along. Alrighty. So testosterone, as far as um, an ideal training routine, okay? If you want to produce a lot of testosterone, if your goal is to hypertrophy muscle, to gain size, all that sort of thing, if you're training people who are looking to get bigger and stronger, all right? The major things that need to be touched on are activating a lot of muscle. As much muscle as you can bring into an activity, the better, okay? So compound motions, okay? For those who aren't familiar with the terminology, a compound lift or a compound motion is one that brings in more than one joint, all right? So if I'm doing a squat, okay, so you say this is my my knee here, all right, got a foot here, so I say ankle, I don't have to spell this, but ankle, all right, cool, and then a hip right here, not exactly hip what I just pointed to, but close enough. All right, so this would be a compound motion because I have 1, 2, 3 joints that are moving, right? Whereas an isolation lift would be something like doing a leg extension, where I may be sitting on a bench and I'm just moving my leg like this, right? So only the knee is being engaged. So that's the difference. A compound lift, as you can imagine, you're pulling in musculature of your posterior chain, your abdominal, you're contracting your back and upper torso here. You got muscles of the hip, you got your hamstrings, you got your quads. Basically, the majority of your body is being engaged to some extent while you do a squat. Whereas if you're doing a leg extension, it's pretty much just your quad, right? You're isolating the quad. So if you can only do a certain number of lifts per day, you're going to get a lot more out of doing compound maneuvers. And the reason beyond it is beyond the fact that you get more testosterone, you also end up getting better coordination, strength gain. Anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but when you do a compound lift, you're also typically engaging larger muscle groups. So the more cross bridges that are being engaged, the more muscle tissue that's being activated, seems to stimulate your body to produce more testosterone. All right. So big lifts, do your compounds. It really doesn't matter if you only want to be one of these like floating torso guys. The ones who've got those like they got really big upper body and they got those nice ripped abs and stuff, and they always wear sweatpants because their legs look like something that should be dangling out of a bird's nest. Even if you want to be one of those guys and you only care about your upper body, you got to be doing your squats and your deadlifts, simply because the amount of testosterone that those lifts elicit, okay, cause your body to overall be more anabolic. So by doing leg workout, you actually end up increasing the rate at which you gain musculature in your upper body. So it's important to realize that sort of thing. All right, so large muscle groups, squats, your deadlifts, bench press, pull-ups, that sort of thing. Okay, that will give you a lot of bang for your buck. Beyond that, as far as intensity goes, the general rule of thumb is the more intense exercise, the better. And intensity when it comes to lifting is a matter of percentage of 1 rep max. Okay, so percentage of 1 rep max is intensity, strictly speaking, in the resistance training realm. All right. Additionally, having lower rest increases your production as well, and then high volume. So volume is the amount you're moving total. So whatever load times number of repetitions performed, you can multiply that out and get a certain number of, say thousands or 10,000s of pounds moved would be a volume. Okay, but it is worth noting that intensity and volume are inversely related. Okay, and you guys pretty much all know this probably, maybe not in the terms that I'm using, but if I increase my load to say 95%, 95% of my 1 rep max, I may be gonna get 3 repetitions. Okay, so I'll get like say 3 reps. If I'm lifting at 85%, I can probably hit 7, 6 to 7, something like that. All right, but I've only dropped 10%, but the amount of repetitions has dropped in half. Okay, say at 85%. Let's just say that's 6 reps. Okay, but at let's see, 85%. All right, but let's say I drop it down to 50%. 50% of 1 rep max. At 50% of my 1 rep max, I can probably do somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 reps. Okay? And if you work out this math, you're going to find that by doing lower intensity, I'm going to get a lot more reps. Okay? This is going to be every way in every step down or up as we go here. As we start increasing the percentage of 1 rep max, the total volume that we're going to be able to move is going to be less per set. Okay, so you can of course always have really long times in the gym and do a ton of sets and whatnot, but strictly speaking, as volume goes up, as volume increases, okay, intensity is going to decrease. All right, and vice versa. As this goes up, that'll go down. All right. That's just the way these things are related. So, so this, as we say, yeah, the more intense the better. It doesn't mean that if you do, single repetitions at 98% of your 1RM for 10 sets, that's only, it's 10 reps at 100%. You're not going to get a lot of volume out of that. So your testosterone release won't be as high as if you work, say, within this range right here, and get 3 to 6 repetitions, or drop it down to something like 6 to 10 reps, but then you'd get a lot of volume in, right? So it's kind of a balancing act. How do I get a lot of intensity, a lot of percentage 1 rep max, while still retaining and getting a lot of volume in my workout? Because those are the two things that together will cause you to have a lot of testosterone release. Chronically, there's little consistency in research, but in general, testosterone doesn't really change much over time. Okay, there may be some changing with the receptors for testosterone. So that research states that if you work out for a long time, if you lift chronically for a long period of time, your muscles may become more receptive to testosterone, which would, as a net result, cause that testosterone to be more effective, but your circulating levels are probably not going to change. Alrighty, so we've talked a little bit about cortisol already. Cortisol, of course, being primarily a catabolic hormone. We spoke about it a little bit in the glucose regulation unit. And it's worth mentioning once again, cortisol has an active role in proteolysis, or the breakdown of protein. So when we're talking about tissue development, it's typically not the most exciting thing we can talk about, right? Because it's the opposite of an anabolic steroid. It is going to actively break down muscle tissue. Okay, and then of course it also inhibits your immune system. It's got a lot of things it does, but there is some evidence that cortisol has a role in the signaling process for remodeling muscle. So so we do need it. It's something that is always going to be there, um, and it may have a role somewhere. Okay, so it's I think it may be we may not know enough um, to blanketly say it's a negative thing. It certainly has roles in survival and keeping you alive under certain stressful situations, and which that's kind of why it's produced. But um, for your typical person who's trying to uh, be more anabolic in building muscle tissue, it's considered more so to be a bad thing. So, acute responses to exercise, cortisol typically is going to follow the same release pattern of what we saw with testosterone. All right. More volume gives you more cortisol. More intensity will give you more cortisol. Lower your rest times. Same pattern. So it's kind of the every rose has its thorn kind of situation. So if you develop a really good program to produce a lot of testosterone acutely, you're probably going to be producing more cortisol as well. It just goes along with it. All right. Chronically, there's once again kind of with testosterone, there's no real change. There's a number of studies which can say that it increases over time or decreases, and others more so which will say that there's no change. The general consensus is that over time of training, over a long period of time, you're not actually going to have a change in your resting cortisol levels. Alrighty, so on to growth hormone. Okay, so growth hormone uh, stimulates muscle growth, protein accumulation by helping with the transport of amino acids directly into the cell, and that cell being stimulated to build proteins. Okay, as we've seen with the glucose regulation unit as well, it also has a role in regulating glucose and keeping you in a good situation there, allowing you to burn fat and that sort of thing. Um, and you see more production with this with exercise, as we saw with that unit. Even there was something like a more than a 2,000% increase in growth hormone release, just endogenously, right? That is within our own body, just naturally, more than 2,000% increase in growth hormone release simply by exercising. So people who go out there and inject themselves with growth hormone, you can get some of the effect of that simply by exercising. All right. So it is linked. Growth hormone is linked to hypertrophy, of course. This much is undeniable. It is worth noting, though, that there aren't really any studies that show that growth hormone in itself leads to performance gains. Okay, performance as in sport performance. So while in a sport like bodybuilding, where the sport is literally just flexing your muscles and having bigger muscles, well, of course you'd have a performance gain there. But for baseball or football, or there's while there is a link to hypertrophy, the typical noted result is that muscles may get bigger, but strength is not typically affected. And that might be a short-term thing. It might be that you have hypertrophy in absence of strength gain initially, and over time you can train that new musculature to become more powerful later. That's not clear, but as I said, there's really no studies which link growth hormone usage to sport performance enhancement. All right. Another thing that should be noted is the growth hormone. There's lots of types of growth hormone, just like there's a lot of precursors to testosterone in the body. There are a lot of different kinds of growth hormone, even within the body. There's a number of different forms. But the general consensus from research is that the hormone that's the growth hormone that's produced in body by you is effectively better than the synthetically produced stuff that some people take as a performance enhancer. So it's just worth noting. As far as acute responses, what we're going to notice here is a lot of what we've been seeing. Okay, so if we go just one than the other, so in order to see growth hormone release, you have to have a certain amount of intensity and volume. Okay, so intensity and volume in order to start seeing release. All right, so this is one set at 20 sets of one at 100% of 1R max. Okay, that's one condition. And alternatively, they found 10 sets of 10 at 70% was better. Okay, so that's overall more volume, right? Multiple sets over single. And this is, I'm going through these. These are just a number of studies which have been done, and these are just the major findings of them. Okay, so multiple sets are better than one. Okay, once again, volume, moderate intensities, high total work, have the highest secretion. Okay, volume, eccentric over concentric. So eccentric muscle action allows you to have more intensity. So that strengthens this idea. And in general, even as we saw with running back in the glucose regulation unit, running will increase growth hormone release. So it's growth hormone seems to have a link to both intensity and volume, but also just overall metabolic demand. So if you're doing exercise that is demanding to your body holistically, right, where you're taxing your glycolytic system, you're producing lactic acid, you're working really hard. You know, a CrossFit metabolic conditioner would be a good example of something like that. You know, grappling, anything like that, where you're having a large metabolic demand in a short period of time, where you have a lot of disturbance of your homeostasis. That's when you're going to see a lot of growth hormone release, and that's roughly the same as what you see with testosterone and cortisol. Chronic release, same deal. You really don't see any change over time. So when you take these things together, what we can say is that while people may gain muscle tissue from lifting long term, they don't actually have more testosterone, cortisol, growth hormone circulating in their body. It's just those factors. You know, maybe the absorption of them may be a little different over time, but in general, it's not that these things, you know, that you just start producing more testosterone because you lift more, and that's why you're so much bigger. It's just you've over time done substantial damage to the body, which has been repaired, you know, over time, and yeah. So chronically, there's no change in these things from a resting perspective. All right, so IGF-1. IGF-1 or IGFs stand for insulin-like growth factors. They're secreted by the liver, and their release is tied to growth hormone stimulated DNA synthesis. All right, so essentially we have a growth hormone interaction with cells, which is then causing mRNA release, translation, transcription, creation of protein. Okay. In that chain of events, IGF secretion is stimulated. All right. Now, as opposed to the other hormones we've spoken a bit about, which are testosterone, growth hormone, cortisol, those things are pretty rapid. So if I go into the gym and I do a single set of squat, you're going to see a change in testosterone and growth hormone and that sort of thing. You're going to start seeing changes rapidly. Insulin-like growth factors, by you know, differentiation, they have a delayed secretion. So typically, you're not really seeing IGF start to circulate too much until 3 to 9 hours after you've had that growth hormone event. Okay, and they may not peak out until something like a day after, 16 to 28 hours post. So for that reason, and the massive amount of fluctuation there, it's one of the main reasons why IGFs are not as well understood as something like testosterone or growth hormone, because when you're designing a study, it's hard to tell when you're going to really be seeing those IGFs start showing up. So anyway, it's also thought that you would have the possibility of load sensitive IGF isoforms, so or mechanogrowth factors here, right here. Okay, so uh, so IGF as once again it's a body of types of hormones. There's many insulin-like growth factors, and anyway, one of which is more of a local kind of hormone. It's not an endocrine, so it's produced by the myofibril itself in response to loading and stretching and stuff. So it's basically being produced for other fibers right around itself. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Once again, very difficult to study because you can't just pull it out of blood. You have to be pulling muscle out in order to be seeing that. And anyway, IGF or even mechanogrowth factors, we kind of know they're important. We don't know exactly everything they do, but they seem to have a role in the hypertrophy process. Okay, so there's unknowns with this. IGF-1 is an effective supplement. I'm not 100% certain as to what grade of purity is actually available out there, and whether or not it's a banned substance. So it depends, I guess, on the organization you're looking at. But it is typically thought to be fairly effective as a growth supplement. All right, acute responses. Once again, it's pretty unclear simply because the onset is so erratic and delayed. So we do know that acutely from exercise you do have a response. It is involved in the muscle growth process, but exactly how you get the most out of it, we don't know. I believe studies that have been done in bodybuilders and people who do typically high volume work in the gym, they tend to have a lot of IGF circulating. But as far as the nuts and bolts of what's exactly the most ideal, that's not certain. All right. Now, what is known is that IGF effectiveness, so how effective the hormone is, tends to be enhanced with resistance training. So that's some combination of increased secretion, reduced binding hormone. Okay, so this just like testosterone has a binding agent or binding protein that it'll kind of be inactive with in the blood, or more receptivity to it. And that's another possibility, is you may have more receptivity to IGF through resistance training. And then eccentric, once again, causes more damage and seems to cause a greater secretion of IGF-1. All right. What we do know is that volume and intensity are important to training programs. You know, it's the same as every other hormone we've seen. And that chronically, so this is not just acute, but chronically, bodybuilders seem to have more IGF circulating at rest due to their training program, and also they have a reduction in the amount of binding protein. So you have kind of a double whammy there, more total and actually less binding protein. So overall, better efficiency of IGF effect.